There is a particular kind of loneliness that lives inside a chat room window. The loneliness of typing something true into a small, glowing box and sending it out to a stranger precisely because a stranger cannot hurt you the way someone who knows your face can. And the chat room incident opens on exactly this loneliness. Shyla logging on not out of idle boredom, but out of a specific hunger. The hunger to say the unsayable to someone who exists for the moment only as text on a screen, and this detail deserves to be read with real tenderness rather than judgment, because what looks from the outside like compulsive online behavior is, from the inside, often something closer to survival, a way of keeping a part of oneself alive that has nowhere else to breathe. The screen name Shyla encounters, deliberately theatrical, clearly chosen to project a specific persona rather than an accurate self-description, functions as a kind of costume, and costumes in queer life have never been mere decoration. They have historically been armor, the necessary disguise that allows a person to say what she actually feels without the immediate risk of that feeling being traced back to her actual face, her actual job, her actual family. And there is something quietly moving about the fact that two women choose fantasy and invention as the vocabulary for approaching real desire, because fantasy, in this context, is not evasion so much as translation, a way of making the unspeakable speakable by first wrapping it in the deniability of just talking, of just imagining, of this isn't really me, this is just a character, even when both women may sense, somewhere beneath the performance, that the feelings underneath are entirely real. What makes the eventual revelation that Shyla and India already know each other so emotionally significant is that it retroactively transforms every prior exchange into something far more vulnerable than either woman realized she was risking, because confiding a private longing to a total stranger carries one kind of exposure, the exposure of being known briefly and then able to disappear, but confiding that same longing to someone who turns out to already occupy a place in your daily life carries an entirely different, much higher stakes kind of exposure. The exposure of discovering that the version of yourself you thought was safely quarantined behind a screen name has, in fact, been seen by someone you will have to face again tomorrow. And this collapse of the anonymous into the familiar is precisely where the story's emotional center lives, in the vertigo of realizing that honesty you believed was consequence-free was actually witnessed by someone whose opinion, whose face, whose ongoing presence in your life matters enormously. Many queer women will recognize this particular vertigo intimately, because the history of queer connection is, in no small part, a history of anonymous or semi-anonymous spaces, letters signed only with initials, personal ads written in code, online forums and chat rooms that flourished specifically because they offered something in-person queer community often could not in earlier decades. A way to find each other without first having to risk the specific irreversible exposure of coming out to someone whose face you would have to look at afterward. And the chat room in this story functions as a direct descendant of that history, a space where two women can rehearse desire, can test out saying the true thing out loud, in an environment that feels, however illusorily, lower stakes than a face-to-face conversation ever could. It is worth dwelling on why this feels lower stakes even when, as the story eventually reveals, it demonstrably is not. Because the psychological function of anonymity has never actually depended on genuine safety. It depends on the feeling of safety, the temporary suspension of the fear of being seen, and that suspension is often exactly what a person needs in order to access and articulate a truth she has been unable to say under the full weight of her real name and real relationships, which means the chat room is not a lesser or lesser real space for these women's feelings to develop. It is, paradoxically, the space that makes the feelings expressible at all, the necessary scaffolding, without which neither woman might have found the nerve to say anything true to the other whatsoever. This dynamic speaks to something larger than this particular story, because it reflects a broader and very real pattern in which admiration, flirtation, or desire between women has often had to travel through some kind of sanctioned distance or disguise before it could be spoken plainly, whether that distance takes the shape of anonymity, of joking deflection, of a shared fantasy frame that can always be waved away as not serious if the other person doesn't reciprocate. And this pattern exists precisely because a culture still uneasy with women's desire for other women rarely offers a low-risk, socially legible way to simply say the true thing directly, meaning that indirection itself becomes, for many queer women, not a failure of courage but an ingeniously improvised workaround, a way to reach toward connection, while still preserving enough deniability to protect against the possibility of rejection or exposure. The fact that both Shyla and India, in the story as described, are simultaneously trying to romance each other from behind these personas, each one reaching, each one still uncertain the other is reaching back, captures something achingly familiar about the choreography of early queer desire, the way two people can be moving toward each other in parallel, each one convinced she is the only one being vulnerable, each one unaware that the other is engaged in the exact same delicate calculation, weighing how much truth she can risk, how much of herself she can reveal before pulling back to safety. And there is real poignancy in imagining these two women, who may see each other regularly in ordinary daylight life, each retreating separately to a screen at night to say to a stranger what they cannot yet say to each other's face, each unknowingly rehearsing with the very same person, the same private hope. When the truth surfaces, when screen names dissolve and the women recognize each other, the emotional register of that moment deserves to be understood as something closer to relief than shock, because whatever embarrassment or vulnerability accompanies the reveal is accompanied by an equally powerful realization that the desire was not misplaced, was not a fantasy in the dismissive sense of the word, but was in fact reciprocated the entire time. And that recognition, the discovery that you were not alone in your longing, that the person you dared to be honest with in the dark was quietly hoping for the exact same thing, is one of the most powerful emotional experiences available to anyone who has ever loved carefully, guardedly, or in secret. And it carries particular weight for queer women, for whom the fear of unrequited or misread desire often carries an additional layer of risk beyond ordinary romantic vulnerability. The fear, not just of rejection but of miscategorization, of being seen as having wanted something that was never available to be wanted in the first place. There is something worth naming, too, in the fact that courage in this story arrives first through a screen name rather than in person, because this ordering reflects an honest and unglamorous truth about how many people, and especially many queer women, actually find their way toward authentic desire, not through a single decisive act of bravery, but through a gradual, mediated process, testing the water anonymously before ever testing it face-to-face. And stories that honor this incremental, indirect path toward honesty do something valuable that more triumphant coming-out narratives sometimes miss. They acknowledge that courage rarely arrives all at once, fully formed, but instead accumulates in small, disguised increments, in words typed and deleted and retyped, in personas that let a person practice honesty before she is ready to own it plainly. And, by the time Shyla and India are ready to bring what they've shared into the light of their ordinary shared life, the anonymous version of their courage has already done the difficult work of proving to each of them, privately, that the desire is real, mutual, and worth the risk of finally being witnessed by someone who already knows their face. Holy